We now continue with David Hume's theory of causation, looking at experience and foretelling. Now, Hume asserts that without experience, we cannot discover what will result or predict beyond an object immediately present to memory and senses. Now, even if an event is seen to follow another, one thing after another, like striking a match and seeming to set, paper on fire, he claims we're not entitled to form a general rule or predict what will happen in similar cases. If a type of event, let us say again, striking a match and placing it against a newspaper, has always been conjoined with another, that is, in this case, the newspaper catching on fire, we predict without reservation one when the other appears. So if someone were to ask you, if I were to take this match and light it and hold it against a newspaper, unless you thought they were up to some trickery, you would say, well, yeah, the newspaper's going to catch on fire. And we suppose a connection. That's to say, we imagine a power in one producing the effect with certainty and necessity. So we suppose there's a power in the burning match to burn the newspaper. So where does this idea come from? Well, what he claims is this. The impression that yields the idea of necessary connection is simply habit. It's the habitual transition of the imagination from an object to its usual attendant. Essentially, what he's claiming is taking the example of the newspaper and the match. So we have this habitual transition where we've seen, fire contacting paper, and pretty much every time we've seen that, maybe with a few exceptions, it's always, burnt. And the exceptions being maybe the match is not held there long enough, or the paper is damp or something. But we see that, fire, paper burns over and over. And what he says is, this is the origin of the idea, and it's the only difference between one instance from which we can never receive the idea of connection and a number of similar instances which suggest it. So his reasoning is that we become essentially habituated. If we see it happen enough, then we start to imagine a necessary connection. But if it happens just one time, we typically don't imagine that connection. And of course, given his love of billiard, he uses a billiard ball example. So imagine, if you will, the first time someone sees a game of billiards, or pool if you prefer. You can imagine a very young, an infant, and they're at the point where now they can, kind of understand a bit about what's going on. So they see, pool being played. So first seeing the communication of motion by impulse, that's to say the stick hitting the ball, you can only say that one event, but not connected with the other. So after observing several instances, a person will start saying they're connected. So you can imagine, the first time the child sees their game of billiards, and if they were somehow asked, what's going on, they would only say, one thing is followed by another. But if the kid sees it happen like enough, and they can talk, they'll say that they are connected. So what's the difference between the first time a person sees like the stick hit the ball and it move, and then observing it occur, many times? Well, what Hume says is the only change is this. Essentially, it's imagination. One imagines the events are connected, and they imagine they can foretell one from the other. So what is it to say that they're connected? Well, for Hume, he essentially is giving a psychoanalysis of this. So to use the usual analogy used for Hume, he thinks it's kind of like a monster in the closet that a child is claiming is there. Now, if the parents go to see, a therapist about, their child saying it's a monster in the closet, The therapist is not going to ask, what type of monster is it? What are its capabilities? What are its vulnerabilities? Do we need to use fire or silver to destroy it? No, the question is not, what is the monster in the closet? The question is, why does the child think there's a monster in the closet? So Hume essentially is doing psychology here. Because just like in the monster in the closet case, unless it's a horror movie, there is no monster in the closet. So the question is, why is this believed? And Hume is looking at causation in a very similar way. So the question is not, what is causation? What is this power? Hume's view is, well, there's no way we can see what this power is. Perhaps there is no power here. And so his analysis is purely psychological. It is not what is the power, what is the connection, but why do we think there's a connection? And his answer is habituation. You see it happen over and over again, and you become habituated. You expect it will happen, and you're willing to say that one thing causes another. The fire of the match causes the fire of the paper. But if you see it happen one time, and then again and again and again, there's no difference between the individual instances. You never see the power. To use a silly example, centuries ago as an undergrad, I had an old black and white TV, and with the rabbit ears and all that stuff. And of course, reception wasn't that good. And one time we were watching a show, and they got the static, the picture got staticky, and I snapped my fingers, and the picture cleared up instantly. And everyone was like, "Wow, that's weird. How did you do that?" And of course, I said, "Magic." Now, the first time it happened, of course, everyone believed that clearly there's no connection. It's pure coincidence. But imagine if I was able to do it over and over. Every time the TV got staticky, I'd snap my fingers, and it would clear up. Now, at that point, there's no difference. The first time I did it, there was no understanding or grasp or no experience of the connection of the power. And the second, third, fourth, fifth, and 1,000th time, nothing has changed. If we took, a movie of each occurrence, and then played them out of order, you wouldn't be able to say, aha, that's the first time, this is the second time, that's the fifth time. They'd all look essentially, the same. Unless, obviously, you're looking at what's playing on the TV. And so, in that case, a person may become habituated to believe there's a connection, but there would be, no difference between the first time and the 1,000th time. Except, of course, habituation. If it happens over and over again, people become conditioned to expect it to happen. So going back to the silly TV example, I do it once, people can kind of laugh and say, what a coincidence. But if I kept doing it over and over, people might start believing that I had some sort of power over the TV. But Hume would say there's no more justification, or in the first case, than the 1,000th case. We just become habituated to expect it. Now, despite this view that essentially it's just a habit of psychology, he says this seems founded on sufficient evidence, at least perhaps to the people who, let's say all of us, who accept this. Now, he does consider cause and effect to be rather important. How so? Well, for him, cause and effect is the foundation of all reasoning concerning what he calls matters of fact or existence. And Hume splits things, this is more epistemology than metaphysics, but Hume splits things into matters of fact, which essentially are what we consider, as he says, existence. It'd be things like statements about what exists, what has occurred, and these would be exactly what it sounds like. It would be something that is a fact. Now, the other type of thing for Hume is what's called relations of ideas. And so a relation of ideas, exactly what it sounds like. It's how our concepts relate, like definitions, etc. So to give a concrete example of distinguishing them, a matter of fact matter would be something like a claim like, I have a triangle on my desk right now. And that'd be a matter of fact. It's something that is, I'm claiming that there is a triangle there, and it's something that is true or false. And for Hume, you can only know about matters of fact empirically. Now, with relations of ideas, that's how the ideas connect. And you can know stuff about relations of ideas a priori. So without looking at my triangle, if I were to ask you, how many sides does this triangle have, you would certainly say 3. And I can't hear you, but of course, let's assume you say 3, and I'm amazed. How did you know you can't see the triangle? It's it's not on camera. But of course, you know that because by definition, triangles have 3 sides. And so for Hume, the way you know matters of fact is by experience, because he's an empiricist. So causal reasoning, cause and effect, he believes is critical to reasoning about matters of fact. Things like, history, medicine, physiology, all that stuff. Pretty much, everything that's not a relation of ideas. And only cause and effect, at least according to him, gives us assurance about objects outside of our current, sensory data and our memory. So this does make sense. If you think about it, the only assurance you have that there is, imagine you're in a building, that there is something outside the building that you saw before, would be that, you reason from cause and effect. So you're on the 3rd floor of a building, you reason that the other floors must still be there, because otherwise you would not be on the 3rd floor, you'd be on the ground. So what is the function of science for Hume? Well, he says the only immediate utility of science is to teach us to control and regulate future events by their causes, which is, essentially a practical aspect of science, namely, what causes what, or so we think, and how do we get the future we want, or avoid the future we don't want. And as he does note, our thoughts and inquiries at every moment are employed about this relation. And this may seem like an odd claim, but it's true. I mean, here's a very simple example. Suppose you're hungry, you'll engage in this causal reasoning. You believe that consuming food will address your hunger. If you're cooking something, you believe that applying heat to it will cook it. The cause, the heat, the effect of being cooked. And so we're always thinking in terms of cause and effect. Now Hume, of course, again, thinks this is more, again, like the monster in the closet, more a matter of psychology than what we consider like metaphysics about what actually is. So when we throw around the term cause, Hume says we essentially are using 2 definitions of the term. And he believes that both definitions are bad. They're bad definitions. So the first definition is this, according to him. We experience that similar objects are always conjoined with similar. So, for example, by object, he's speaking very broadly, like a burning match and burning paper. Those would be 2 objects. So we experience, they're conjoined. So his first definition is this. An object followed by another, and all objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. And again, he's taking object, pretty broadly. So to give an example, think of the match and the paper. So you have the burning match, and then you have the burning match applied to the paper, and it's the burning match being touched to the paper is followed by burning paper. So, put another way, the definition could be taken as this. If the first object had not been, the second object would have never existed. It's kind of a but-for cause, which is one they use in law. The idea being that if a person hadn't applied the burning match to the paper burning paper would have, the paper would not have been burning. And this is, commonly used concept of cause. Second definition of cause. The appearance of a cause always conveys the mind, by customary transition, to the idea of the effect, essentially habituation. So the definition, put strictly would be this. An object followed by another, and whose appearance always conveys the thought to that of the other. So think of like the saying we have, where there's smoke, there's fire. You could take that as a second definition. Namely, when you think of smoke, you therefore then think of fire. And so for Hume, those are 2 definitions presented. One is that, an object followed by another, that if the first had not been, the second also would not have existed, or the effect would not occur. The second definition essentially is that the mind, goes from the idea of one to the idea of the other. Now, these might seem to be the same, but they're importantly different, because one is talking about, an object followed by another, and the other is talking about how the mind, has the association. It thinks the appearance of one causes, well, probably a bad use of the term, but brings about the thought of another. So under the first definition, it would be like applying fire to an object that can burn, causes it to catch on fire. The second would be, again, when you think of applying an object that's on fire to another object that can burn, you think of the second object burning. So one is about our thinking about it. So what's the problem with these definitions, according to Hume? What he claims is that both definitions come from circumstances that are quite foreign to the cause. How so? Well, we lack, according to him, a definition that includes the circumstances in the cause, connecting it with the effect. And as he's contended before, he asserts, we have no idea of this connection, nor do we have a distinct notion of what we even desire to know. So pretty harsh, because his view is we don't know what the connection is, and we don't even know what we don't know, in a way. To illustrate this, he gives the example of vibration, say like a string vibrating on a guitar. So we say that the vibration of a string causes a sound, like on a guitar. We mean that this vibration is followed by this sound, and A, all similar vibrations were followed by similar sounds, or B, on the appearance of one, the mind anticipates the senses and forms the idea of the other. So in one case you have one thing following another, in one case you have an idea following another. So he says the relation of cause and effect can be considered in either way, but he claims we have no idea of it beyond these two, and so these definitions he believes are problematic. They don't actually tell us what cause truly is, or so he claims.